my name is Fred Zahn, and I work for the Metro Historic Commission. My name actually is Fred Zahn, unlike everybody else you're going to hear today. But I'm here to give you a little bit of a background. I'm your narrator for the day, and I'm going to lay some facts on you before you really get rolling. First thing I'd like to do is to tell you that this cemetery was opened in 1820. It started out as just a little 4-acre plot, the densest section you see back in there, section 28, and it expanded 6 times throughout its history up to a maximum of 24 acres, which included a large Catholic section on the other side of the railroad tracks. Now, after the Civil War, there was a great growth and reorganizing of things here in town. The railroad, turns out they decided they needed a few more tracks going around St. Cloud Hill, and unfortunately the Catholics were all in the way. So they had to get up and move, and they established Calvary Cemetery over off of Fessler's Lane. Now, you wouldn't think there'd be a lot of coming and going, but it's not as uncommon as you might believe. Another question we get very frequently is, what's the oldest grave in here? Well, the cemetery again was opened in 1820, but there's actually quite a few people who died and were buried long before that, because there was an older cemetery downtown, and when they built the Nashville courthouse, well, all those folks were in the way, and they had to get up and move. And they came here. Now, during the Civil War, those earliest records from 1820 to 1846, unfortunately, they were destroyed and lost, and so we don't have as good information, but we know they're here. We know they're here somewhere. Now, a lot of folks ask, but what makes this place so special? Why is this place special? Well, that's because this is public. Well, now, let me tell you what I mean. So there are other cemeteries in town which are historically contemporary with this one. They're as old, but they're all private. So they're a family or a little community or even a church group and even economic strata. Kind of think of the country club or something like that. Well, this place has been public since day one, and because of that, we've got them all. We've got blacks and whites and Jews and Christians. We got rich and poor. We've got common laborers. We've got criminals, penitentiary inmates. We've got the founders of Nashville, James and Charlotte Robertson and their son. We've got everybody. Because of that, it's a much richer story to tell. And really, that's what history is. The names and the dates, those are important, but they're names and dates. History is a collection of stories. And it's really the stories that make it interesting and important. And that's what you're here to do today, is you're here to tour around, and you're going to hear some of those stories. And when you do, I want you to think about all these people who died so long ago. And I want you to think about how really similar they are to us today. You know, they all had mamas and daddies. Some of them had brothers and sisters, and some of them had kids. They all had hard days and struggles and challenges. They all had good days, too. But you know what? They all ended up here. Death is a great equalizer in life. And at the end of the day, we are all remarkably similar. Remarkably similar. One of the real great tragedies is to be forgotten and to be lost to time. And so that you're here today to tour around and hear a lot of these stories, well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your support and your interest. It means the world to us. It really does. I hope you enjoy yourself.
My name is General James Robertson, and I was the leader of an expeditionary party that came to French Lick from the Watauga settlements. After crossing the Cumberland Mountains, we had arrived here in December of 1779. It was a long and difficult trip, but luckily we did not encounter any hostile Indians along the way. Later, you will meet my young son, Jonathan, who also accompanied us on the trip.
Good day. My name is Andrew Ewing. I arrived here in May of 1780. I was here to sign the Cumberland Compact with 56 other men, which enabled us to establish our government here. I was 40 years old. 3 years later, I was elected county court clerk, for which I was paid 500 raccoon skins a year. I was signed and recorded all marriages, deeds, and wills.
When we first arrived at French Lick, we did not encounter any hostile Indians. However, soon after, our conflict with the Indians began. My company and I were determined to settle this area. As well, the Indians were equally determined to drive us out. We did, however, have few friends among the Indians, one of whom you'll have the opportunity to meet later. His name is Pio Mingo.
It was said that I had excellent handwriting. Some people said it required a magnifying glass to read the county court records. I signed the marriage bond for Andrew Jackson and Rachel Robards.
I recognize the importance of maintaining good relations with the Spanish in order to reduce the number of attacks from Spanish-allied Indian tribes. So, it was my idea to rename this area the Miro District after the Spanish governor of Louisiana, who assisted Continental forces during the Revolutionary War. Now, the Spanish were crafty and no real friends of ours. However, we did share a mutual disdain for the British.
In 1794, I was requested to deliver a letter to Andrew McGilvery, the chief of the Creek Indians. The letter requested that the Creek cease attacks on the Cumberland settlements. It was to no avail. The attacks continued.
After defeating the Chickamauga at the Battle of Nickajack in September of 1794, our conflict with the Indians was largely over, and 2 years later, Tennessee was officially recognized as a state. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Robertson. I'm the son of James Robertson, who you met earlier. Later you will meet my mother, Charlotte Robertson, who came, I was born in North Carolina. When my father arranged the search party to go through Kentucky, I was so excited. But later on, I figured out that it wasn't as fun as I thought. So we went through Kentucky down into French Lick, where but we got there in early December, but it didn't actually. But the lake we couldn't cross immediately because the river didn't freeze over till December. So, but my mother didn't come with us. She was traveling on Colonel Donaldson's boat, the Good Adventure. I watched for her every day. And finally, when she came, I was so happy, I sounded my horn. Does anybody have any questions? This is French.
Good afternoon and welcome. As many of you may know, I'm Judge John McNary. What you may not realize is I was born in Horsepen Creek in North Carolina in 1762, 14 years before the American Revolution. I am the eldest of 9 children in my family, and I studied very hard because I always knew that I wanted to be an attorney. At age 18, I moved to Salisbury, North Carolina, to study law with John McCain. Guess who else was also a student there? Andrew Jackson. In 1788, at age 25, I left Carolina to assume my duties as Superior Court Judge for Davidson and Sumner County here on the Cumberland frontier. On the way in East Tennessee, our party were attacked by Indians, and we lost absolutely everything but our lives. We had to swim the river to escape them. One of my first duties as judge here was to appoint Andrew Jackson as district attorney. He was then only 21 years old. Law and order was quite a problem in the settlement, and I had to prescribe harsh punishments as prescribed by the laws of the day. Horse thieves were considered a particularly terrible criminal. In 1793, I sentenced John McCain, Jr., the first horse thief in town. He was sent to the stocks, and he was given 39 lashes on his bare back. Both of his ears were cut off, and an H and a T were branded on his cheeks for horse thief. Now, of course, you understand that horses were important for survival on the frontier. You needed them to pull your wagon to and from church and to market, to plow the fields, and they were the main means of outrunning Indian attacks. Today, my wife Mary and I live at our farm, Bellevue. It's 477 acres near McNary Springs, on the other side of the tallest hill in town. We do not have any children of our own, but we stay very involved with the lives of my many nieces and nephews. In fact, in 1790, almost my entire family moved from North Carolina to Nashville. But I think the best thing that I ever did in my life was to appoint Andrew Jackson as district attorney in 1788. Now, here in 1806, he has become both a legislator and a judge. He recently purchased a new farm east of town called the Hermitage, where he and his wife Rachel have settled. I do wonder what he'll do with the rest of his life.
Chokma, Sahochafoy, Piaminko. Hello, my name is Piaminko. I am Chickasaw. I was born around 1750 in Chocalisa, which is near present-day Tupelo, Mississippi. My birth name is not known. It's very often a fact that Native people have names and ranks that change as they grow older, and I became known as Piaminko, the mountain leader. Most Minkos at the time were either peacetime or wartime Minkos, but I was both. I was a warrior, but I was also thought of as a statesman. When I was a very young child, my mother took me to live with the Cherokee Nation, and I grew up there. My adopted uncle was a man by the name of Little Turkey. He was the very first principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. While there, I learned to speak the Cherokee language as well as I could my own. I also could speak with the French, with the Spanish, and I speak English quite well. About the time that the Revolutionary War was to start, I moved back to Chocofala, which is today Tupelo. My wish for our nation at the time was to remain neutral and not ally formally with either side. But the British sought us as allies. They offered us complete protection in exchange for our military service, but we refused and chose to remain neutral. We did, in a way, side with the British because we wanted to preserve our people, preserve our culture, and preserve our land. So we always fought with the Americans, and it was always over land. In 1779, a man by the name of James Robertson brought a group of settlers here to French Lick. French Lick was actually established in 1717 as a fur trade community. The settlers built a fort not too far from here overlooking the Cumberland River on a high bluff, and they called that Bluff Station. The Cherokees, under the leadership of Dragon Canoe, attacked that station at every opportunity. Mr. Robertson lost 2 sons and 2 brothers, and he is also several times wounded during those attacks. The settlers built many stations in the area, and one of those was called Freeland. I led 150 warriors against Freeland. The day after the attack, all of the settlers moved from Freeland back into Bluff, but they only stayed there a year before they came back. In late fall of 1781, we received word that the British had surrendered and there was no longer a neutral line to walk, and we were forced to seek a peace treaty with the Americans. So once again, we came here to French Lick. We saw a treaty with James Robertson at his home, and in October of 1783, we did sign that treaty. That home became the first Chickasaw agency, and James Robertson became a lifelong friend of mine and of the Chickasaw Nation. We called him Little Father. During that time, I formed a very fast friendship with General George Washington. General Washington gave me this coat, it's an officer's coat, and this peace medal that I wear. He also agreed to have my oldest daughter formally educated, and my friend James Robertson oversaw the payments for that education. Thank you for coming today, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your tour.
Well, Charlotte and I, we'd been here nearly 15 years when we were tasked with feeding 100 Indians. Before here, we'd been living northeast in the mountains on the Holston River till we got word from Richard Henderson. He told us that he had land, bountiful and beautiful, and he wanted us to help settle. So Charlotte and I, we set out on the Good Boat Adventure. And what an adventure it was. I was a widow at the time with 3 young little girls. Charlotte had children of her own. So, on the flatboat, I tried to distract them. I taught them reading, writing, and numbers. On the Sabbath, we taught the Bible.
I shall never forget our journey over the waterways, and what a perilous voyage it was, hampered by severe winter weather, hostile Indians, and even smallpox. Many of you know what a treacherous river the Tennessee River is, and of the miles of dangerous shoals and rapids. And traveling up the Ohio and Cumberland rivers was most arduous as well, and required every able body, man, woman, or child, to help hold the flatboat against the current. It was April of 1780, and we were poling around yet one more bend in the Cumberland River, and we caught sight of a few cabins standing high on the bluff ahead. What a joyous day. We had finally reached the Salt Lick in the safety of Fort Nashborough at last. It had been a long trip and food had been scarce. We were most eager to get our crops planted. That winter had been peaceful at Fort Nashborough. However, by spring and our arrival, the Indians began attacking, and this would be a way of life that would persist for many, many years. 2 of my children, my sons, were killed, and 1 was scalped and left for dead, but miraculously survived. And my husband, James, and Ann's brother was wounded 3 times. James would often be gone for long periods defending us, negotiating with Indian chiefs, friendly and otherwise, and besieging North Carolina, of which we were a part until 1789, to send urgent supplies and defense.
It wasn't all bad, though. I fell in love with a blacksmith named John Cockrell, and in 1788, we were married. It was a wonderful wedding and a fantastic feast. We had bear, we had deer, all sorts of fowl. I'd never seen a meal like it until the one Charlotte and I put on for the 100 Chickasaw and their chief, Piamingo.
It was 1794, and we had little notice and much trepidation about this planned visit from the Indians. You see, people were still being scalped and killed at this time. Chief Piamingo was being accompanied by 30 Chickasaw warriors. They were headed to Philadelphia to speak with President Washington. There was much activity also from Chickasaws and Choctaw braves headed north to serve as scouts for the army of Major General Anthony Wayne up north of the Ohio.
They had us prepare a feast in May, which meant the crops had just been planted. We had to make do with the leftovers, the winter stores, root vegetables. My brother James, by this point, had been promoted to Brigadier General. And General Robertson, he implored his friend Bennett Searcy, asking for whiskey, for meal, for beef, and for pork. Bennett Searcy wanted to make sure that these Indians were well fed. And well fed they were. I can see 100 of them seated, kneeling, enjoying our food that we prepared.
And I recognized the faces of several of the Indians, who, as I recall, had been just a few years earlier and had been most curious about the brick making that was taking place as we built our new brick home. And they had lingered to observe and sometimes had helped us a bit. Well, Brigadier General Robertson knew well of Chief Piamingo's intentions to speak to the president, and that it was most important for him to carry a good report. For you see, by this time we were still not a state, but were now part of the territory south of the Ohio. And as such, we were dependent on the federal government for our protection. Well, Ann and I made certain that the Indians were generously fed, and they left quite satisfied. It would be another year or so before the Indian troubles here in the Miro district subsided, and we've gradually begun to enjoy a more peaceful way of life. This lovely little French beaded purse was given to my husband James by Chief Piamingo as a gesture of friendship. I have to wonder how it came to be in Indian hands, but I suppose at one time a French fur trader perhaps used it to barter with the Indians.
I'm Robert Renfro. I'm a well-known innkeeper in downtown Nashville, and a lot of people say that my place is the best in town, although I do have a lot of competitors. Now, if you're downtown and about, you may have heard of me referred to as Black Bob, as that was my name, Bob, when I was a slave. About 15 or 20 years ago, I was auctioned off, and I was bought by Mr. Robert Searcy. Now, Mr. Robert Searcy was a very influential man here in Nashville and Davidson County because he was on the board of trustees at Davidson Academy. But first of all, he was the state treasurer of Tennessee, Mr. Robert Searcy. Now, Mr. Searcy knew that I could run a successful place. So in 1794, I was granted permission by the county court, which allowed me to operate my business in downtown Nashville. Here's a copy of my license, downtown Nashville. I was able to operate my business. And it was so successful, a lot of influential people who came to my place liked me, and in 1801, a petition was signed and given to the state legislatures, asking them to allow me to be emancipated. And so it was given. And I became my own free man, a free man of color here in Nashville and Davidson County in 1801. 1801. Now, Mr. Searcy never said anything about it, but I am so sure that he had something to do with it. I'm sure he helped because, as I said, he was a very influential man. He knew all the legislatures, plus he was the treasurer for the state of Tennessee. 2 years after that, I bought my building from Mr. Searcy, which is lot number 25 on the public square. Lot 25 is where my livery stable and my inn are located today, and where I hope for it to be many years to come. Lot 25 in Nashville, Tennessee. A lot of gentlemen come to my establishment and they stay with me, and where they could get good meals, and where a bar is kept, where they could bed their horses, and they could rent one from me as well if they want to. A rumor got started a little while ago, and I don't know how that happened, that I had sold my business. And why would I want to sell my successful business? I don't know why that rumor would start, but nevertheless, I had to put an ad in the newspaper letting everybody know that I was still there, I was still in business. So here I am today up under the Cross Keys on the square, and one of my favorite and one of my best, most frequent customers is Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson may be around here somewhere, and you could ask him about the Cross Keys. Thank you all so very much for coming today, and have a good day.
Now, you see, folks come to know me by one of two ways, and sometimes by a third way, which is the combination of the two. You either come to know me by the word of the Lord and by your own volition, and it's a free will response to the Lord calling your name. Or you come in these. See, I'm Edward Hobbs, and I'm the city jailer. And I'm also an elder in the Methodist Church. And for the moment, the church and the jail are the same thing. You see, our previous building, which was right on the city square, because of the growth of the city, had to move, and so now the congregation meets in my building. And some of you, I am quite certain, spend a little bit too much time with me by, look at this shirt. If this is not an example of sinful depravity, and I'm quite certain that he will be in my house of worship in the morning, not by his own volition. However, some Sunday mornings we have a very large congregation because of that, and they have no choice but to listen to the preaching. Now, until we get a larger structure built, you have to remember that Bishop Asbury and Bishop McKendry, both of which come and stay at the jail, and I remind you they do so, I assure you, by their own choice and not by force. And when we have preaching there by these circuit riding preachers, it is quite the service. So I would encourage you to come down to the jail. Again, by choice, not because the sheriff has issued a warrant for you. And madam, I'm a little suspicious of you too. Yeah. Now, the local Presbyterians, though, are constantly saying that they do hope someday that the Methodists will get out of jail. I think that's ironic, since they have yet to meet in a building thus far. Of course, I'm sure they're waiting for some preordained, predestined decision to do so. Now, as you travel down this path, I hope you do say, keep in mind that the Lord is always with you. If you run into to Bishop Asbury, do tell him that we wish him best and we do hope his safe return to Nashville. Thank you for coming out this afternoon, and I do hope I see you in the morning by your choice.
My name is Anthony Foster. I came to Nashville and lived here in the 1790s before Tennessee was a state. I was many things. I was a surveyor, an attorney, primarily a merchant of fine goods. Unlike my close friends, I was not part of the War of Independence. That was my father, also Anthony Foster, who traveled from Virginia to Kentucky and then on to Nashville. With me is my close friend, Reverend William Hume.
Good day. I am William Hume. I was born in Scotland and went to the University of Edinburgh. I came here in 1801 and I've lived here ever since. I'm a Presbyterian preacher, and I followed in the footsteps of Reverend Thomas Craighead, who came here about 15 years before I did. Maybe you didn't know, many of the Scots and Scots-Irish that came to Nashville were Presbyterian.
In addition to the occupations that I shared with you, I was able to travel extensively, which was rare at that time. I spent a great deal of time in Philadelphia, dealing with John Robertson and the acquisition of new land grants in this part of our emerging country. And I could dress up with the finest English gentleman in Philadelphia, but unlike him, I could don a deerskin outfit and be in the woods and fight for our nation. I tried to have peace treaties with the Chickasaws and the Choctaws. Disgusting. They would not agree to peace.
When I first came to Nashville, I was preaching in a wee brick building near the public square. The Methodists have a church here already in Nashville, and the Baptists have a church in Kentucky. But right now we do not have a Presbyterian church in Nashville, and I would like very much someday for us to build one.
So with that, we bid you farewell. Have a wonderful day.
Good afternoon. I am Simon the Jockey, and I want to let you know that you're looking at the most successful jockey ever to race. My story, I was brought from Africa as a small boy, born in about 1781. My family was brought to South Carolina, and South Carolina is the horse racing capital of the world. Everybody raced horses, even the slaves did, and I was no exception. I was about 4'6", and I used to hang around the racetrack. I learned how to ride, how to win. Pretty soon I had a reputation. Everybody wanted me to ride for them, and I was a slave, but I never really worried about that because of my talent, and I had always enough money from tips and gifts. Horse racing in Tennessee started in 1804. Andrew Jackson was part owner of Clover Bottom Racetrack. Andrew Jackson got into a heated discussion one time with a man named Charles Dickinson. It ended in a duel where Jackson killed Charles Dickinson, and I'm pretty sure he would have liked to kill me too. Andrew Jackson could never beat me when I was riding my horse Maria. One time Andrew Jackson told me, he said, "Don't you spit in my horse's eye while we're racing?" I told him he had never got close enough for me to spit in his horse's eye. Thank you.